before the genetic thing you're thinking about is way more been messed with at all. Of course, that's not meant to justify some weirdo ooh, but at the same point, it does show you an amount of change that's been deviated by farmers and things, right? Um, it further evolved into what today is Mexico and southwestern United States and what we think of as the Wild West, into the vaquero of northern Mexico and the Caro or Jalisco and the Mohican regions. While most haciendos, or ranch owners, were ethnically Spanish criollos, many early vaqueros were Native Americans trained to work for Spanish missions and caring for the missions' herds. So American Amerindians were in on it too, very, very much so. In fact, how did they get all their, Indians didn't have horses. A lot of people get a vision of them and everything, and that came much later through things like this and so on. Don Juan Onate sent an expedition across the Rio Grande in New Mexico, bringing along 7,000 head of cattle. From this beginning, the vaqueros of Mestizo heritage drove cattle from New Mexico and later Texas down to Mexico City. Mexican traditions spread across the south and north, influencing equestrian traditions through Argentina to Canada. Canada, oh yeah, they have a big rodeo thing and huge cattle thing that goes on up there. Most people think, oh, it's in Texas and this, that, the other. No, Florida's got their own thing going on. There are cattle ranches that are well known that are in California and stuff too, but everybody knows in Montana and Wyoming are well thick with it. Well, go north, go across the border, Calgary. That's well known. It may be the biggest rodeo now. And English speaking traders, rising of the cowboy here. Um, as English speaking traders, oh, I just realized it flipped. I was hoping I was going to get to about here and then flip it. Well, hopefully it didn't leave out too much of what I was saying. Sometimes when it flips, it cuts out about 30 seconds, but we'll continue. This is part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, go to the very end of this in the top left-hand corner. We'll take you back to part 1. You can watch the entire thing. As English-speaking traders and settlers expanded westward, English and Spanish traditions, language, and culture merged to some degree. Before the Mexican-American War in 1848, New England merchants who traveled by ships to California and encountered both the haciendos and vaqueros trading manufactured goods for the hides and tallow produced from vast cattle ranches. American traders along what later became as the Santa Fe Trail had similar contacts with vaquero life. Starting with these early encounters, the lifestyle and language of the vaquero began a transformation of which merged with English cultural traditions and produced from what became known in American culture as the cowboy. So when you see this Wild West situation, it's kind of a conglomerate of the times and things that were going on, and pretty much taking the best of both worlds and putting it all together, if you will. The arrival of English-speaking settlers in Texas began in 1821. Rip Ford described the country between Laredo and Corpus Christi as inhabited by countless droves of mustangs already and wild cattle, abandoned by Mexicans when they were ordered to evacuate this country between the Nueces and Rio Grande by General Valentin Canizalo. The horses and cattle abandoned invited the raids of Texians. That's a thing before Texas became itself. Made up this territory. California, on the other hand, did not see a large influx of settlers from the United States until after the Mexican-American War. However, in slightly different ways, both areas contributed to the evolution of the iconic American cowboy, particularly with the arrival of railroads and increased demand for beef. In the wake of the American Civil War, older traditions combined with the need to drive cattle from the ranches they were raised on to the nearest railheads, often hundreds of miles away. And so this was the ancient cattle trails that they run things into and stuff. Here's the debunked thing I was talking about. We'll just go through it. Black cowboys in the American West accounted for up to 25%. Later they'll make another comment that it's 15, but people have inflated. Made up to 25% of the workers in the range cattle industry from 1860 to 1880s, estimated to be between 6,000 and 9,000 workers. Typically former slaves born into the families of former slaves, many black men had skills in cattle handling and headed west at the end of the Civil War. Well, how did they have the skills in it? Well, they were taught that on the places they were at. Some of these places they were at had horses and things going on. Some of it leads today to the people who have bred these incredible Kentucky Derby winners and all these type of things of horse breeders in situations. There wasn't everything just a plantation. It wasn't all cotton, just mainly. But they say it could be 6,000 and 9,000 workers and up to 25%. But that guy that was the thing on the debunk actually said they were the first cowboys. Of course, if you look down in the things below that, they also say that they were the actual Amerindians, they were the Egyptians, and all these other things that, of course, we all know that they weren't. And there's the problem that ensues from that. And if somebody doesn't get that under control pretty soon, they're just going to, never mind. By the 1880s, the expansion of the cattle industry resulted in a need for additional open range. Thus, many ranchers expanded into the Northwest, where there were still large tracts of unsettled grassland. Cattle were herded north into the Rocky Mountains, west in the Dakotas. The cowboy adapted much of his gear to the colder conditions, and westward movement of the industry also led to intermingling of regional traditions from California to Texas, often with the cowboy taking the most useful elements of each. You know, you could rewrite that and change California and Texas and a few other things in that last whole statement and going west and say the same thing about ancient Proto-Indo-Europeans. Moving westward in the industry also led to intermingling of regional traditions from the Ural Mountains all the way to Ireland, often with the cowboy taking the most useful elements of each. Yeah, but then that's not the origin of it. So when we talk about who were the first cowboys, well, of course, it was the people that domesticated cows, or you couldn't have it. And if we think of it as, okay, well, the horseback version, that's still the same people. Yeah, and same people that brought us dogs, and through a series of events, pretty much every modern thing that we have in front of us right now. But Mustang runners, wild horses. Wild horses couldn't drag me away. Mustang runners, or mustaneros, were cowboys and vaqueros who caught, broke, and drove Mustangs to market in Mexico and later American territories in what is now northern Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, and California. They caught the Mustangs that roamed the Great Plains and San Joaquin Valley of California and later in the Great Basin from 18th century until the 20th century. There's still herds of wild Mustangs. Large numbers of cattle lived in semi-feral or semi-wild state on the open range and were left to graze, mostly unintended for much of the year. In many cases, different ranchers formed associations and grazed their cattle together in the same areas and range. In order to determine the ownership, individual animals were marked with a distinctive brand applied with a hot iron, usually while the cattle were still young as calves. Primary cattle breed seemed to be open range was the Longhorn, descended from the original Spanish Longhorns imported in the 16th century, though the Longhorn, by the late 19th century, other breeds of cattle were also brought west, including the Meteor Hereford, and often were crossbred with Longhorns. Now, if we look at a Longhorn, of course, Texas Longhorn, we know that. And so they have a longer horn. It's not real thick like the old Botoros and ancient cows where a lot of this thing all came from out of, but they've got longer horns. Is there any reason to have the longer horns? Well, they know that this is a hardier cow, much hardier cow. And the horns are just a byproduct is what you're told. But I'm willing to tell you that in the process, we're in a time whenever people really liked horns and things like that, and it went along with everything. Those things came as a package together. Brands, though, and being able to brand a cattle, see if they'll show you here. Yeah, and he's taking a hot iron and sticking it to him, and then they let him go. That's all it really is. And that's been going on for a whole lot longer than the Americas. Yeah, a whole lot longer. And being able to mark your cow. In fact, in elder times, a lot of times they marked them on the ear. And you can see this guy on the right, how he's clipping this little tag in its ear. Well, that's going to be a number. And it'll go along with this stuff in their paperwork and stuff that goes on. But in ancient times, they would take a real sharp knife and cut little things and assemble in the ears of every one. And it was the same thing. Sometimes it'd be one notch in one ear and the other would have two and this, that, the other. And it was their way of being able to identify their cows. and say, oh, well, your cows aren't like that. And they go, come over and look. Every single one of my cows are like that. That's one of my cows. There's no question. The branding situation also goes from earlier than that. But today we talk about Hereford cattle. And so it's the white face type cattle that everybody knows, beefo type of cattle that goes on. The ranch that I was on had a special form of Angus cattle that was going on. It's like a Brangus Emulus 8 crossbreed, and it's real famous too for it because it's a limousine type cattle also in their genetics, which is something that was bred to end up being a little longer. And through the process of putting this and that together with Angus and making it happen, they ended up getting a bigger, meatier cow that still was longer, hardy as hell, genetics and so on, and they're extremely famous. Maybe I'll tell you more of a story about it, but because I'm getting on to maybe even a third point of this, I'm might going to bypass a couple of these, but we'll try to tell them to you. So anyhow, in order to find young calves for branding and sort out mature animals in turn state, ranchers would hold a roundup. Usually in the spring, a roundup required a number of specialized skills on the part of both cowboys and horses. Make no doubt about it, these horses had to know what the hell's going on. If you didn't have your horse trained to be able to do this type of thing, wasn't going to happen. Individuals who separated cattle from the herd required the highest level of skill and rode specially trained cutting horses. See if they'll show you a picture of it going on here. You can see a horse that's doing this here, and it's, wish I could show you a video, but this horse here is cutting this cow out of a group. Now, it could be something as simple as he's got red cows and black cows together and he's separating them. It could be males and females, youngsters and older ones, a lot of situations where they're trying to do it. But I'm telling you, these good ones at it are so intelligent. If you look, this guy's just got his hands barely holding onto the reins and really not doing so much of the job. The horse, once he understands, oh, you want the little black ones, he'll start doing it. On that ranch that I worked on, one of the major guys that was there had a horse that was so well trained he could do so many tricks. He let himself in and out of trailers, all kinds of things. But what was cool is you could take him out and say, and you start cutting the little red cows out, and then he'd stop and get off the horse, and he'd go up and tell him something in his ear and pat him on the ass, and he would go out and cut all the rest of them and keep them separated all by himself while Appleby was over here talking. It's not like they need you once you show them what they need to do. I've always been real impressed whenever I saw that, but I've always been real impressed even after, just thinking about that situation where people give horses credit for this or maybe that, and then you find out old stories of war horses and all things that went on, and you're like, some of these horses were bred to be smarter, intelligent, have a purpose, and then they were trained so well, they pulled it off. That's incredible. So they use these cutting horses, trained to follow the movements of cattle, capable of stopping and turning faster than other horses. Once cattle were sorted, most cowboys were required to rope young calves and restrain them to be branded. In the case, most bull calves were castrated. Occasionally, it was also necessary to restrain older cattle for branding and other treatments. But they generally kept ones that they felt were of the best of the group of males non-castrated, and these would be the sires of the herd and some generations after. This concept of bull, Taurus, the great bull of heaven, sires like Osiris, and to be the sire of a whole group of animals goes back much, much earlier. And of course, people that were in power and doing these things, sire, and you hear that whenever they're talking about ancient kings and situations like that. Large number of horses were needed for a roundup. Each cowboy would require 3 or 4 fresh horses in the course of a day's work. Yeah, they could wear one out. You could ruin a horse. Horses themselves were also rounded up. It is common practice in the West for young foals to be born of tame mares, but allowed to grow up wild in a semi-feral state on the open range. There were also wild herds, often known as mustangs, but both were rounded up and mature animals tamed, the process called horse breaking or bronco busting. See what they'll show you here. So this is trying to teach a horse how to do something and become familiar with you and what you need and expect of it and things, and it really becomes something like a dog in some ways. It's amazing. I had a couple of horses once I became a wrangler at this ranch, and I was able to raise them and keep them. One of them we were breaking right then, one was too young, and I used to give him watermelon Jolly Ranchers. It was my favorite, but damn, he loved those things. Had a horse call that I couldn't do right now, it'd be too loud. Kind of has a woo kind of to it, but you could do this from as far away as you could see him, and he'd come running. Most all the horses would too. They'd start realizing somebody was up there, and you're going to get some oats or some food or some things like that. But you get an understanding. What you have to do is you have to take blankets and put them on them, and then you take them back off, and you put them back on them, and you put them back off, and you put them back on them, and you put a little weight on it, and then you take it back off, and then you take it off, and then you put it back on them, then you take it off, and you brush them down. What? Yeah, and you do that a whole bunch before you ever try to get on them. You're not jumping on the thing like a buck and bronco situation. To treat a horse right, to do it right, and make him understand and everything, it goes through a whole process of this breaking the horse in. Bronco even comes from bronc, which has to do with ancient wording too, so it can show you that that concept is way back in the days. It's usually performed by cowboys, though, that are professionals in training horses. In some cases, extremely brutal methods were used to tame horses, and spurs and all whipping and things like this. Such animals tended never to be completely reliable, however. Other cowboys became aware of the need to treat these more humane fashion and modified their horse training methods, often relearning techniques used by the vaqueros, particularly those of the California tradition. Horses trained in a gentler fashion were more reliable and useful for a wide variety of tasks. Indeed, you realize that now today, but there were people probably, they want to act like, oh, all of them were mean to the horses, but these one guys, no, it's not the way it really was in any way, shape, or form. But there are weird breaking methods that they would use for them to break the spirit of the horse, and that's basically if they couldn't get it to happen naturally. Informal competition arose between cowboys seeking to test their cattle and horse trading skills, horse handling skills against each other, and thus from the necessarily task of the working cowboy, the sport of rodeo developed. Much like the Olympic Games originally started, where people were talking about their prowess, and I can throw a spear farther than you. Oh yeah, well, oh, I can do it too. Okay, let's see who can throw it the farthest. In fact, every year from now, we're going to get, well, I can't do it every year. Well, every 4 years. Yeah. Cattle drives. Ooh, let's take a look at a picture real quick here of a cattle drive. This is a cattle drive, and it's just really coming through the southwest of the United States here and driving the cattle up out to people out in the southwest to be fed by pretty much stuff that probably came through Texas or other routes. It's funny as some of these major routes ended up being the best places in the world for barbecue too, and their styles. But then again, that goes hand in hand with it too. Here you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, probably 8 people out there running the cows around and so on. But it doesn't take that much to hurt them. Really, you get kind of behind them, and then if they start to go a little too far to the right, you can get a little on the right, and they'll veer back a little bit. It doesn't take too much. You don't have to be like a dog running around, barking at them or anything. It's just a slow, subtle movement. Once you get them moving, they move pretty easy. Prior to the mid-19th century, most ranchers primarily raised cattle for their own needs and sell surplus meat and hides locally. There's also a limited market for hides, horns, and hooves and tallow-associated marketing processes. Well, we don't really think about it. How many products do we have that are made out of leather? I had this conversation with somebody a long time ago, and I brought up leather and stuff and everything, and they were like, and then I started describing all the things like a saddle, and that man's belt, and his holster, and the bridle and everything. It's made out of leather. But also that couch over there is made out of leather, and this is made out of leather, and I see your leather jacket over there on that peg, and then yeah, and it just started overwhelming him a little bit, and he's like, wow, and I go, yeah, we still use it a lot today. It's fantastic. Still using hides, not like a caveman anymore. They've been real clean and shaved and done and tanned and so on. Yeah, there was a lot of that going on in ancient days too, to lesser degree as we go back. The demand for beef increased significantly by 1866. Oh, weird statement here. Prior to 1865, there was little demand for beef. However, at the end of the American Civil War, Philip Danforth Armour, famous Armour Foods, opened a meatpacking plant in Chicago, which became known as Armour and Company. With the expansion of meatpacking industry, the demand for beef increased significantly by 1866. 1 year later, all of a sudden, well, I wonder how much of a real pivotal moment that is. Of course, if I was doing a book report on Danforth Hammer, it sure as hell would be, wouldn't it? Cattle could be sold to northern markets as much as $40 per head. I don't know if they're working on old money there, but if they are, that's an extreme large amount of money. But then you figure out if you cut them all into steaks and do all the things with it, you may be a chance of making up $100 out of it. Well, that's big money. Well, you got to pay all the cowboys and everything else out of that too, so it's about $80. So you maybe make $20 a head, maybe 15. How many cows did you buy? A hell of a lot. Now you've got a lot of money. First large-scale effort to drive cattle from Texas to the nearest railroad shipment to Chicago occurred in 1866 when many Texas ranchers banded together to drive their cattle to the closest point the railroad tracks reached, which at that time was Sedalia, Missouri. However, farmers in eastern Kansas, afraid that longhorns would transmit cattle fever to local animals as well as trample crops, formed groups that threatened to beat or shoot cattlemen found on their lands. Therefore, in 1806, the drive failed to reach the railroad and the cattle herds were sold for low prices. However, in 1867, a cattle shipping facility was built west of farm country, and the railhead at Abilene, Kansas became a center for cattle shipping. This really screwed over the people there in Sedalia, Missouri. Have you ever heard of it? Right. The route from Texas to Abilene became known as the Chisholm Trail, after Jesse Chisholm, who marked the route. It ran through the present-day Oklahoma, which was Indian territory at the time. So later, other trails forked off to different railheads, including those at Dodge City and Wichita, Kansas. By 1877, the largest of the cattle shipping boom towns, Dodge City, Kansas, shipped out 500,000 head of cattle. Cattle drives had to strike a balance between speed and the weight of cattle. While cattle could be driven as far as 25 miles in a single day, perhaps, they would lose so much of their weight that they would be hard to sell when they reached the end of their trail, and so they'd fatten one up and get them there skinny. Usually they were taking shorter distances each day, allowing periods to rest and graze both at midday and at night. On average, the herd could maintain healthy weight moving about 15 miles per day. Such a pace meant that it would take as long as 2 months to travel from a home ranch to a railroad. The Chisholm Trail, for example, was 1,000 miles long. So this was not, I'm going to go down to the store. Nowadays, it's a lot more convenient for every major city has meatpacking plants and so on like that, and all you've got to do is take and put them up into trailers, and you get it there. An average, a single herd cattle on a drive numbered about 3,000 head. To herd cattle, a crew of at least 10,000 cowboys were needed, with 3 horses per cowboy. Cowboys worked in shifts to watch the cattle 24 hours a day, herding them in proper direction in the daytime and watching them at night like shepherds to prevent stampedes and deter theft or, oh, who knows what else, animals trying to attack them. The crew also included a cook, was very important, who drove a chuck wagon, usually pulled by oxen, and a horse wrangler to take charge of the remuda, or the herd of spare horses. Remuda is basically so you can change out horses. It's a remedy, it fixes you, it means changing mounts. And so the wrangler on a cattle drive was often a very young cowboy or one of lower social status. But the cook was particularly well respected, member of the crew, and was not only was he in charge of the food, but he also was in charge of medical supplies and had a working knowledge of practical medicine. So he's kind of like the doctor of the group too. Damn it, Jim, I'm a doctor, not a cowboy. Barbed wire, funny how that man was actually both. But barbed wire, an innovation in the 1880s, allowed cattle to be confined in designated areas to prevent overgrazing of the range. In Texas and surrounding areas, increased population required ranchers to fence off their individual lands, and so you have quarantined off areas that they could forage in, and you could grow your crops right there next to them, and they couldn't get to it. But what it took was barbed wire. Let's see what they'll show here. There's a picture of barbed wire down there, and it really is just coiled wire, and then there's a spool with the ends left not cut off like bobbed wire, but barbed. So they have barbs on them. Barbarians knew how to make barbed wire. For it's really just something like a thorn thicket thrown into the idea. You have a regular old fence, these cows can just push it right over. Well, secret be known is that they're more docile than you give credit for, and they allow themselves to happen. For a lot of times they'll break out of that barbed wire. They can just push right through it. It's no big deal. Oh, sure, it made ouch, ouch. Oh, big deal. They'll push right through it. If I ever get to the story of what happened whenever we did something that looked like the thing in the top there, maybe you'll understand a little bit about what I just said. An innovation of the 1880s allowed cattle to be confined in designated areas to prevent overgrazing of the range. In Texas and surrounding areas, increased population required ranchers to fence off their lands. So you get this barbed wire all going on. But later, cattle drives were over, and they end up making modern cattle trucks. And cattle trucks and rail cars were used in a lot of ways, and it made it a whole lot easier, and you didn't have to drive the the horses, or do any of that much anymore. All you had to do was take and load them up into smaller cars and take them to the major place, and then they would wrangle them into the cars and go from there. Of course, there's somebody buying them along the way, and then somebody selling and buying them again, selling and buying them again, then they get to you. Then people cut all that meat up and they want their cut and so on, and that's why meat is somewhat expensive. If you could cut out a few of those middlemen in some way, that'd make it a lot better, but it seems like there's in play the set middlemen. Anyhow, American cowboys' ethnicity. They were drawn from multiple sources. By the late 1860s, following the American Civil War of the expansion of the cattle industry, former soldiers from both the Union and Confederacy came west seeking work, as did large numbers of restless white men in general. A significant number of African American freedmen also were drawn to the cowboy life, in part because there was not quite as much discrimination in the West as was in areas of American society at the time. A significant number of Mexicans and American Indians already living in the region also worked as cowboys. Laterly, particularly after 1890, when American policy promoted assimilation of Indian people, some Indian boarding schools also taught ranching skills. Today, some Native Americans in the western United States own cattle and ranches, and some are still employed as cowboys, especially on ranches located near Indian reservations. The Indian cowboy is part of the rodeo circuit itself. Because cowboys ranked low in the social structure of the period, there's no firm figures for the actual proportion of various races. One writer states that cowboys were of two classes: those recruited from Texas and other states in the eastern slope, and Mexicans from the southwestern region. Census records suggest that about 15% of all cowboys were African American ancestry. So it's 15% maybe. Yeah, well, that's about the amount of the population they are, really. So ranging from about 25% on the trail drives out of Texas to very few in the Northwest. Similarly, cowboys of Mexican descent, so what they're saying there is that on these trail drives, there are maybe 15%. On the ones coming out of Texas, maybe as much as 25%, but really almost none in the Northwest. Well, if you average the whole thing out, does it even come out to 15? I don't want to minimize it in any way, but one of the reasons that I was set to do this right here is that somebody told me they were the original cowboys and all this stuff, but it doesn't appear that that has any truth to it whatsoever. Similarly, cowboys of a Mexican descent are also averaged about 15% of the total, so about the same 15%, so not really the cowboys. in common in Texas and Southwest. Some estimates suggest that the late 19th century, 1 out of every 3 cowboys was a Mexican vaquero, and 20% may have been African American. So they're saying 30% would have been there and 20% African American, so that'd make almost half of them. But whenever you look at reality, you would have to say, no. There was a lot of banditos. Are you saying those are the cowboys that we're talking about? Well, not really, but they were cowboyish people too. Oh, well, if you figure it that way, then you'd say, yeah, but still it wouldn't end up being half of the Wild Wild West, would it? No. No, in no way would it be. Regardless of ethnicity, most cowboys came from lower social classes and the pay was poor. The average cowboy earned approximately $1 a day plus food, and when he was near his home ranch, he had a bed in a bunkhouse, usually a barracks-like building with a single open room. This is much like longhouses and stuff of the ancients, so it's really nothing new. It was just a giant ranch house. Whenever I lived on that ranch, we had giant ranch houses where on both ends they had dormitory-ish type things with people living in them, but in the center they had center rooms. There was even kitchens in part of them, but really we had a separate kitchen thing that everybody went to. You only had a few choices, but damn, everything was pretty damn good there. Hell, it's where I learned how to make sausage gravy and biscuits. And cook bacon right. Know what I'm talking about? Over time, the cowboys of the American West developed a personal culture of their own, a blend of frontier and Victorian values. So, not Mexicans, really, no. And values that even retain vestiges of chivalry. Yes, yes, yes. You can look back at it and really tell that that was the last of chivalry that was there. Well, some rode on until modern day, but oh, you'd say by the 1950s or so on, it probably pretty much died just about there. But some people say it wanted to kill itself. Such hazardous work was in isolated conditions, also bred a tradition of self-dependence and individualism, with a great value put on personal honesty. Exemplified by songs and poetry, the cowboy often worked in an all-male environment, particularly on cattle drives, and in the frontier West, men significantly outnumbered the women. Well, they have that, but also there was a cowboy code, and it was just pretty much as strong as the pirates code that they went by, that pretty much, that's that way. And people may have heard about it even in modern, in the first movies that came out in old days and stuff and everything. They had a cowboy code. Now we're going to get to Brokeback Mountain. However, some men were also drawn to the frontier because they were attracted to men. At times in a region where men outnumbered women, even social events normally intended to be both sexes were at times male. Men could be found at partnering up with one another for dances. Now you're trying to make that into something. The square dances and all those things went on, and they're outnumbered super male. That's one of the reasons square dances aren't really like cheek to cheek, are they? Yeah, and it's more of a gathering and get together and dancing. Dancing doesn't have to be of a sexual nature all the time. Definitely not. You look at the Indians doing their rain dance. It was all a bunch of men. Oh, they're gay. No, that's not. Stop it. Homosexual acts, though, between young and unmarried men occurred, but the cowboys' culture itself was and remains deeply homophobic. Though anti-sodomy laws were in common in the Old West, they were often only selectively enforced. So, yeah, that really not so much. But there's your Brokeback Mountain moment, guys. The traditions of the working cowboy. You know, they had Wild West shows and things like that. And I'm just going to kind of go back through this. Western movies popularized person stereotypes, and of course, there's always a gunslinger. But then, of course, there's the same type of guy that's the sheriff that makes it all happen, and he's a damn good gunslinger too, boy. Yeah, you ever watch Gunsmoke? There's bad guy gunslingers, and there's good ones. Oh, it's just like modern day. There's bad guys and good guys. Yeah, and there's cops. That eventually came out of that whole situation. So they promoted positive values, though, such as the cowboy code of Gene Autry that encouraged honorable behavior, respect, and patriotism. What? Oh, yeah. Oh, it was real common in the Old West. And all of America had it at one time. I know in 2020, with everything going on, it's almost hard to believe that situation. But some of us are still proud and respectful of what happened to America and all the people that ended up making it happen. Under spacemen in the modern day, and if you'd have gone back just a few hundred years ago and told somebody that, they'd tell you were crazy. Likewise, movies often shown fighting with American Indians and cowboys. You know, the old cowboys and Indians. It was a thing when I was a kid, and well before off of it. You grow up playing, and you switched out who was going to play who. However, most armed conflicts in between Native American people and cavalry units between the U.S. Army really wasn't so much the way people see it. Relations between cowboys and Native Americans were varied, but generally not particularly friendly. Native people usually allowed cattle herds to pass through for a toll of 10 cents a head. You think 10 cents a head? No, listen, that was a lot of money, actually. Yeah, my dad used to pick cotton for 4 cents an hour, and he could take my mom and him out and watch a drive-through and both eat burgers and have a shake and have another more than a nickel left over for gas, which gave him enough gas to make that happen. A nickel. So 10 cents a head is nothing, especially these people that are pumping 3,000 to 10,000 cattle across there. What does that come out to be? I'm not going to do the math, but that's okay, or whatever. But raided cattle also, and raided cattle drives and ranches in times of active white native conflict or food shortages. In the 1860s, for example, the Comanche created problems in the western Texas drives. Similar attacks also occurred with the Apache, Cheyenne, and Ute Indians. Cowboys were armed against both predators and human thieves, and often used their guns to run off people of any race who attempted to steal or rustle cattle. In fact, cattle rustling was quite a thing. People, instead of trying to get some cows and then grow them up and get enough cows to where they could breed and keep that essentially going, why don't you just steal some? What are you going to do with them then? Well, we're going to sell them. Well, they've got that other dude's brand on it. And what are you going to do? Brand over that brand? Try to make it like, oh my God, there's all these things that went on. Let's see where we're at. 37. I don't want to bypass cowgirls in any way here. Be disrespectful of it because, hell, I like cowgirls. Yeah. But cowgirls were rarely taken on the cattle drives necessarily, and probably for obvious reasons. But there were times when they were too, because there was enough respect going on to where there was nothing stupid going to go on. Little doubt that women, particularly the wives and daughters of men who owned small ranches, could not afford to hire large numbers of outside laborers. They worked side by side with the men and thus needed to ride horses and be able to perform related tasks. In most of these cases, the women were supposed to be wearing dresses, though, and you aren't even supposed to saddle up like a regular man. You're supposed to side saddle and do all these things, and people get around where nobody's looking, and they'd be like, ride that horse like you're supposed to. Some of these girls are incredible horsemen in equestrianship. Some of these girls are world champions now. You can see these equestrians going on. You look at something like the movie Brave and how she was learning to shoot off of a horse. You can look at old Amazonian women and how that was going on too. You look at later, and there was Annie Oakley, right? While impractical for everyday work, the side saddle was a tool that gave women the ability to ride horses in respectable public events because they weren't wearing pants. See, women used to not be able to wear pants, so they have this funny side saddle where their legs are cropped up on this, and they have one on one side, and they can just hop off of that. Boy, it's not good for riding at any speed, and in a gallop and a clop, 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 you just get flopped off that thing quick. It requires special skill to sit and ride like that. Right? But women and horses are connected in so many ways other than just what you normally think of, also. Through all the religions and things like that we've talked about too. There's definite connections. So they talk about rodeo industry, and the growth of rodeo brought about such cowgirls as Fanny Speary Steele, the same rough stock, and took the same risks as men, all by wearing heavy split skirt that were more encumbering than men's trousers, and competed at major rodeos such as Calgary Stampede and Cheyenne Frontier Days. All that ended, though, in the death of Bonnie McCarroll in 1929 Pendleton Roundup, and that led to the elimination of women's bronc riding in the rodeo competition. It got to be a little too much, and I don't think they were ever really bull riders or necessarily something. That was really more of a macho, like, how long can you stay on this guy? Oh, that leads me into a little story here. So one of my dad's major golfing buddies that he had, and is one of his best friends, if not his best friend, for the major part of his life. His son, which I knew him as to be a nerd and everything, and after me going away and and coming back, come to find out that his son, Brent, was going to end up being in a rodeo. And I was like, what's he trying to do? And he goes, oh no, he's already done this, he's already done that. In fact, he got a chance to ride Dakota and make $50,000 out of it, and he did it. And what? And he, yeah, but he got hurt last year, and he had had his face smashed. So now he wears a face mask whenever he does it, like a like a hockey mask, basically, or something like that, caged that he wears now, but he never did before. And all these guys don't do it and everything else. I thought, and that kind of blew my mind. But because everybody would think it's a little Jewish kid and a nerd, and then you see him riding a bull, and you're like, call him a little Jewish nerd now. He will kick your ass. Anyhow, boys and girls are more apt to compete against each other with all events, high school rodeos, as well as OMOC competition, where boys can be seen traditionally women's events such as barrel racing. Well, men are using cutting horses to cut all the things too and everything. That's really their event, but it's something women can excel in too, so they pretty much gave that to them. You find that in events too and everything. Well, they just let that go. They could still have both of them, but then you're going, oh, look at the men's best by the women's best, and everybody wants to try to do things like that. Why's it got to be like that? Look at the best baby maker. It's not the men. How about that? How about the best mother then? Well, it can't be a man. You've got to just be satisfied in all of those things. Not that you have to be some kind of Amazonian queen. They were known for a lot of things: cutting, reining, endurance riding, so on. Reining is a neat thing. Reining is where they can take and stop a horse and do everything. People think that's cruel and everything they do to them, but they train these horses to know exactly what they're doing by simple gestures, clicks of their mouth, simple noises, the way they tug and they do things, and they can get them to go through a whole routine. And then it's pretty much like a dog, where they already know their routine. All you do is you're going through the thing and you're reinforcing it with the clicks, but you could pretty much get off of him, and he probably do it all by his own. You start him off, you go, you ready? Here's your music. Nah. Not enough credit's given to the horse in this situation too, by the way. For it's all this cowboy. Look at all what he's done. Look at how incredible the horse is. He's able to have pulled off this type of thing. And he's willing to do it to show you his prowess. There used to be a term called puissance. It's only used in horses nowadays, and it shows strength with dexterity. So it's not just the fastest, but it's the fastest with an intent and all those things. It's not just the strongest, but the something who's able to do something strong with dexterity. And that's what something that they emblazoned in horses, but actually humans themselves, and in the endeavor of the Olympic Games and everything that comes out of that, do the same thing. Where they talk here equestrian events, Olympics, Western riding, all of those things, horse show classes, and so on. Again, nobody gets a louder revelry than anybody whenever the Queen of Rodeo comes out and she's in her sequined outfit, sometimes nowadays lit all up like a Christmas tree, and they'll come out and you'll see her, and then she is the emblazon of the woman of the West, and everybody loses their mind over it, and then they dim down the lights and you can see she's got her lights on, and everybody puts a reverie to it. Something quite touching. Looks like we're going to part 3 here, guys. So click in your top left hand corner and we'll go on. I'll see you there. Peace.